As discussed in previous episodes, when journeying down a spiritual path, one of the most common questions asked, usually as the result of a series of circumstances that lead us to that very moment, is, who am I? The answer to which is generally found to be a profound one, and hopefully further encourage us down that path of self-discovery through which we discover or rediscover aspects of who we are that had either never before occurred to us or were long ago forgotten. Until recently, this level of self-reflection was a luxury to the average person, reserved mainly for the noble and wealthy few who had the resources for such pursuits, or monks. Since the advent, though, of modern technology combined with prolonged periods of prosperity, it has become increasingly possible for the average person to actually see and realize their hopes and dreams than ever before. Imagine living in the shoes of our ancestors, who wanted nothing more than to leave a legacy of prosperity and freedom for future generations. Having lived in survival mode for most, if not their entire lives, it's easy to see why this would be so important to them, especially considering that most of us still live in survival mode for much of our lives now, myself included. But as is often the case in the modern age, as referred to by Carl Jung as generativity versus stagnation, a stage of life that lasts from around the age of 40 till 65, most of us use that time in our lives when things start to calm down a bit to look back in consideration of where we have been and where we would like to go next, what we can contribute to the next generation. Welcome back to another episode of Going 5D with Destiny Dawn. I'm your host, Destiny Dawn. And as having been through the infamous midlife crisis, I think a better term for it would be Act 3, where we take a look back and reflect on previous acts to do some reconciliation that helps us put our existence, present moment, into perspective. Act 1 being before we started lives that required us to fight for the survival of ourselves, our children, families, and whatever existence that we made a priority over our own well-being. Don't get me wrong, a big part of that is in establishing our identities and creating those lives for ourselves. So to some degree, that is what we wanted, right? We work hard to build it up, enough security to make a name for ourselves, to carve out a piece just for us, to raise people, and maybe even have some leftover funds or abundance to start saving for some non-essential things. While we are starting to see more young adults prioritizing their desire to live out their dreams at a younger age before starting a family, including more people than ever before deciding not to at all, older generations were not raised that way, and were encouraged from a very young age to practice our future parental roles throughout our childhood. This has changed quite a bit. We were raised, so to speak, to be ready for that inevitable family that we were going to establish, while we were still young enough for grandparents to get to be part of those lives. Now, mind you, as selfish as that may sound, it was just programmed into us. Until the last century, most people really did live in survival mode, often for their entire lives, and usually died before they even reached the age of 40, including many deaths during childbirth and other hardships. It was not uncommon at all for a family to see less than half their children make it to adulthood. You think you've got it hard. Seeing things from that perspective, it would be easy to understand why starting early increased the odds of having at least a few viable descendants with which to carry on the bloodline. That is, after all, instinctual. Or it was, until modern medicine and having created several generations of humans living in a time of relative prosperity and peace, at least enough to be able to get a decent education, and empower ourselves and others to co-create things bigger than ourselves, free from having to worry about propagating our species, since there are apparently still plenty of people around to do that, and are doing so quite efficiently. For those who did not grow up so empowered, there eventually does come a time, for one reason or another, when we must reevaluate everything. Sometimes it's just because we hit rock bottom. Sometimes we just have that moment of lucidity or clarity, when our minds are quieted and we find ourselves sitting in silence, not just ready for the journey, but in need of it. At some point in our lives, we are faced with remembering who we once were and what it was we once wanted or enjoyed in our lives. If that wasn't how things played out for you, of course. Although I doubt there are a lot of people that... Anyway, not having this happen until your midlife crisis probably means that you were too busy or had not yet been ready for what that revelation has in store for you. If you had not had one of those moments, but you are wondering things like why you are here, where things went wrong, or where to go from here, especially if you saw the title of this episode and went, ooh, that one looks interesting. You're probably here for a reason, and I'm happy to help give you some insight, maybe even help point you in the right direction. For me, survival was all I had known from the age of 15 until around 40, right on schedule with when my children started to grow up and move away, simultaneously questioning the well-paying job that I would ultimately leave. There were many questions I sat with that led me to the big one, who am I? But as mentioned before, that's definitely not where I started. It was actually the whole self-care part that included other forms of self-reflection. But destiny, what does this have to do with the meaning of life? Great question. Simple. Because understanding why you are here, the lessons that brought you to this point, and where you want or feel compelled to go from here paints a picture of what your soul is working on at the moment, since that is the meaning of life, the experiences we have and the lessons that we learned along the way. We're here to learn and experience. When one is able to focus attention on themselves, such as with quantum healing hypnosis, a question often asked is with regards one's own purpose. Asking this question is a reasonable one, which is why it's important, it seems, that many of us are collectively asking the question, including many from a younger age that have seen that trend. That tells me that as a species, while most of us have reached a point in the middle of our lives, the fact that it's happening for all sorts of reasons, even in young people, that we are reaching a point where we want to do more with our existence than simply survive. Since we discussed much of this in the episode titled I Am, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and get away from that and focus on how you can determine this and walk through an exercise with you that I discussed in various forms with others throughout my life. I came across a term I immediately resonated with over a year ago, known as a way shower. I believe that one of the things I came here to do in this lifetime, which I got out of doing these exercises, was just that, to be a way shower. For those who are not already familiar with this term, it refers to a person who helps others find their path, leading their way back to it, or in creating a new one entirely. Well, before learning this term, I was fiercely interested in learning to channel, as I've talked about a bunch of times, which was pretty much from the moment I learned about it. I would go on to spend several months trying my hardest to clear the path, and to some degree I still am, so to speak, doing the shadow work in order to raise my vibration, and again, as mentioned previously, started with self-love and self-care. By my logic at the time, raising my vibration would not be possible if I did not genuinely try to explore any sort of unfinished business from my past, even though I did not feel at the time it was going to be necessary. In any case, something did tell me that it was going to include my childhood, that I would need to go back and revisit some of those memories, some of those pains and anguishes, since it seemed it was often necessary to explore at some point anyway. After everything I had recently learned about my exploration in understanding inter- or extra-dimensionals and spirituality, my most earnest of efforts were mainly because, while nobody else would know how much effort I put in, I knew that I would, my guides would, and that this knowledge in itself would prohibit me from evolving were I not to go balls in. So needless to say, I did some serious reflecting, made easier by the fact that much of the previous summer was spent on learning my ancestry. Spoiler alert, I have every single color of ancestor, and that was just on my mom's side. So I was starting to make correlations about what someone with my genetics and astrological information and all this other stuff could possibly need all of those attributes for, which I also referenced in previous episodes. As I recommend everyone do, I pulled my astrological birth chart, even learning in-depth information on how to read a birth chart. Another spoiler, unless you have copious amounts of time on your hand, while it's fascinating, it's going to take a long fucking time. At least it did for me. I highly recommend doing it for free, online, like I did at astrocafe.com. It's nice. I did do mine, and then I would compare it with online birth charts just to make sure that I got it right. But I gotta say, unless you plan on being an astrologer, it's really not worth the effort. So, after combining this information, it was starting to become clear which lessons had popped up over and over and why I picked the attributes that I did, since I had already bit off on the idea and still believe to this day that I picked my life, my body, my everything before I came here. And those attributes, the latter of which aligned very much with my true personality. Turned out I am absolutely 100% almost equal parts Sagittarius and Capricorn. And I determined that I clearly came here as a wounded healer based upon the research that I had done, with the determination to not only see many adverse situations through, or anything I set my mind to, with all the charm and precision needed to forge my way through a diverse and challenging road. But I knew there had to be more to it than that. And I've mentioned I know all of this before, but not this part. I knew that there had to be a reason that someone would put so many odd aspects in their charts. That was one thing. I actually had it checked by an astrologer too. And they had confirmed I have all of these different symbols in my chart, different aspects. And it's a very complex chart. And I'm like, okay, I can deal with just about anything, but why would I want to tell everyone about everything along the way? For whatever reason, it feels like I just have to tell most people that I see daily, everything going on in my life. Just been very vocal. Ask anyone. I have zero shame, never have, which has bitten me in the ass more than a couple times, but usually ends up going pretty well and has also helped people that were or would go through the same shit. I used to be somewhat capable of knowing what to say and what not to say, but in reflecting on this, it occurred to me that at some point I basically stopped giving a shit about worrying what other people might think of me, dealing with things like money issues, marital issues, whatever. The only thing I usually kept to myself was anything to do with being low vision, being blind in one eye, unless I was scared or I had to, for fear of injuring myself or others. Like I mentioned, at some point, I did mention it to some point to everyone after I would get to know them, but I generally avoided discussing it unless it was brought up by someone else because I didn't want to be seen as disabled or different in any way. You could already look at me and tell because one eye went in the other direction until I was 31, which I would eventually make peace with. But enough about me. This is where the exercise happens. Grab a paper and pen before proceeding, if possible, so that you can write down the answers and reference back to them. Consider your accomplishments. What are the first 3 things that come to mind? Your greatest accomplishments. Just sit with that just for a few seconds. What are the first 3 things that come to mind? I'll give you a moment. Okay, next, think about your failures. Consider your failures. What are the first 3 that come to your mind? Again, take a few seconds. Consider your failures. What are the first 3 things to come to mind? What do you think you failed at or you wish you could redo? Now, think about any things that you wish you would have done in your past. Now, the easiest way to do this one, which isn't really that easy, it's actually kind of lengthy, but I highly recommend people do it anyway, is to sit down and try to remember, and you don't have to go like 1, 2, 3, because you don't remember everything, but as you're thinking about your earliest memories, and you just think about your age, oftentimes something will pop up. I know it sounds exhaustive, but don't think too hard on it either, because the whole idea is to get the answers that first pop into your mind. So again, the question was things that you wish you would have done in the past, going all the way back from childhood. Doing this one by one, I discovered what memories stood out in my mind, and I believe that other people will do the same. And this process really helped me to see some patterns. So the next thing I want you to do is write down the first 3 patterns that you notice in doing that. Once you have that list, flip that piece of paper over or get a new one. Now, from each year, what do you remember about what you wanted to be? Did you become that person? I want you to think about that. Whether it was a job or a fantasy or whatever it was, going as far back as you can remember. What did you want to be or want to do? And did you become that person? If you did, would you have been proud of that person looking back from that perspective, or looking forward rather from that perspective? And if not, why? And what can you do to become that person, or do you still want to be that person? I'll give you a minute. You might even need to pause. That's okay. Feel free to pause and come back. Next question. What do you like to do now, and why? Now, compare who you are, who you were, and who you wish to be. What have you learned? If this is done correctly, it should show you what you still have left to do, to learn and experience. Or at least this was a really good indicator for me. It suddenly became very clear that the visual stuff and disappointment about not being able to get away from the career path I had been in for so long were weighing heavily on me. So to recap on that, first I wanted to be a princess. Okay, that's not entirely reasonable, I know, but it's true. And then around, 7 or 8, I wanted to be like an artist. I loved to draw. I loved to draw as a kid. And I loved to do these little presentations to my family. So there was some point where I wanted to be anything where I could present something to people. Like I thought about a teacher or a scientist or a lawyer. Now, mind you, at this point I was like 9 or 10. So I didn't understand those jobs fully, and the internet wasn't a thing. So around 12 or 13, I wanted to be a singer-songwriter. I spent every year of public school in choir, so that one didn't really surprise me because I love being in front of people. I loved singing. I loved writing, so it just made sense. But I was too scared to sing alone in front of people. So then, the next one, which is my late teens, I wanted to be a writer. Right about that time, my parents had split up, and by the recommendations of Job Corps and other places like school, they made me talk to counselors. Although I felt it was completely unnecessary at the time, I thought what they did was pretty amazing. So there was a point that I did want to be a psychologist, and that one really kind of stuck with me to a certain degree for the rest of my life. But then I grew up, and I had family members, mainly nurses, encouraging me to follow in their footsteps into a great career path that made a lot of money. And I wish, looking back, that it would have been because we want to help people. Maybe I would have liked the idea more. But I did like the idea because I like the idea of money. So I got my CNA license, and I did start down the nursing path, and I would re-explore it a couple of times. But I did realize how hard it was and doubted myself a lot. I didn't have much money either or support at the time, so it just seemed impossible. After I had my daughter, the idea of spending 4 straight years in college with little to no income at the time seemed absolutely impossible. Needless to say, I stuck with what I knew, talking. I had taken a telemarketing job at 21, become an administrative medical assistant at 24, which I got to do for a whole year as a medical billing rep before the economic downturn happened and my entire department was laid off. It took years before I could find a good medical billing job again without having to have 5+ years of experience. And by then, the information I had gotten was fairly outdated. I'd have to go back and get some recertifications. It was a whole thing. So I went back to sales. Doing sales, I wrote my first book at 26. Didn't make a fortune, I know, crazy. But I would go on to earn my associate's degree in psychology at 35, which was when I ran out of financial aid. As hard as it is, or as hard as I tried to get out of sales, there was no easy path out, obviously. And next thing I know, I'd been working at some capacity or another in sales for over 25 years. Funny thing is, as a salesman, I rarely had to sell anyone on anything. In fact, I had always joked that my job was to have great conversations with people every day. And I strived to just be very knowledgeable about the product that I was selling. I actually received training from a really good company that taught me about that pretty early on, that a good salesman only has to sell the value of something. I rarely had to actually push anyone into anything, and usually it was because they kept coming back to me. I knew they wanted something, but anyway. I strived to be knowledgeable about the product that I was selling so well that I needed only point them in the right direction and explain why. Again, I'm a talker. I can come up with a positive or negative about just about anything. Point being, once I connected the dots, I could see these patterns emerging that needed to be addressed. Like, why did I doubt myself? Oh, because even if they didn't, I believe, after being bullied as a kid, that everyone saw me as disabled. And to be honest, I can remember a lot of examples. They all kind of blur together, of course, but there were a lot of people who would look at me and see my eye going the other direction and have a completely different opinion about me. It was heartbreaking. So to some degree, I had good reason for feeling that way. And, I did end up having a corrective cosmetic surgery at the age of 31. I had a couple as a kid too, but they didn't take as well, which is pretty common, I guess. Especially back in the 80s when the technology was not exactly the best. But the difference in how people perceived me really was night and day. I actually did a paper on it in my sociology class in college because it was crazy. I got jobs easier. I got asked out all the time. It was crazy. But by that point, having accomplished everything that I had, it was time to let that fear and defensiveness go, even if they were for valid reasons at the time. It was time to let them go. So the next question was, okay, well, now that I know about all these other things, what do I want to do? Which led me to, I don't know, what do I like to do? So that's where that looking back really helped me. I still loved art, so I started painting. Started doing resin work, which was a lot of fun. Painting was a lot of fun too. I still have, like, on my laptop some little dots of resin that will probably never come off, as well as on my old coffee table and a couple other things because I don't see very well. Not sure if you heard about that. Anyway, but I thought a lot about what I wanted to do, what I still loved to do, and another big thing for me was cooking. Since me and my husband eat a plant-based diet, mostly vegan, I learned how to make anything that I used to eat into a plant-based version, which is kind of an art in itself, to be honest. So I knew I loved art, cooking, and obviously talking. So I started there. See where I'm going with this? Your experiences up to this point, good, bad, or otherwise, have all been part of the plan. And they've led you to this very moment. Just like all the things going on outside in our world, which I want to touch on briefly today as well. In discussing the meaning of life, we really need to go beyond just our own perspectives, because meaning of life isn't just about us, our own existence. It's also about taking a look at things that are going on around us from a much broader perspective, because the meaning of life would have to apply to everyone, right? How can anything matter or make sense when there's so much chaos going on in our lives, though, right? Without going all the way back down that rabbit hole, especially since we've already covered a lot of that at length in previous episodes, I believe that it's because humanity had to experience a lot of ugly things. As impossible as it may seem, we are just now getting used to not having to deal with a lot of shit. And there's going to be some trial and error, some fighting, some crying, and some ugly things, but we will get there. I do believe that. Take a step back and look at where we've been as a people, not just yourself. We're working on our series right now. It's a book series of at least 9 at this point, and my husband he's well into the 3rd, and I'm working on editing the 1st. I already edited technically the 2nd, but we're going to go back and make a bunch of revisions, so I'm back working on the 1st right now. And I do a lot of research for that pretty frequently. And one of the parts that are in the book that I'm working on has to do with what was going on during the First Crusades. So we're talking about around 1100 AD. And it's pretty crazy, I gotta say. Like, the idea of having someone take away your freedom of religion, they would rape and pillage these villages that anyone that was worshiping something other than what they were selling, basically. And I think maybe even at a cellular level, I've always had an axe to grind about that. I know that deep within me, there's a real problem that I have with that. I know that there's been periods of time where women weren't allowed to talk. So even just from the female's perspective, we've come a long ways, but the idea of control, it's been done for a long time. There's just been this giant penis contest going for like thousands of years. And as crazy as it might seem right now with everything going on, it's been worse. It really has. You don't see any mongrels like roaming through the area, burning down everything, right? There's a lot of things that we have to be thankful for. A lot of things that we have to appreciate. A lot of ways of living that we haven't experienced previously. Like I talked about in I think my first episode, I fucking love ice. I know that I appreciate ice more than the average person does. It's weird, I know. But I love ice. And I really feel like in this weird way, it's because I got to experience it. And I went through a lot of phases of, different things that I feel like I worked out this weird karma about, like food, getting to make and enjoy food. I don't think I really got to before. I don't think most of us got to before. And maybe that's wired in because of this collective consciousness experience. I don't know. But I find it interesting to correlate these things with where we're at with them now. I guess what I'm saying is that the meaning of life isn't going to go about it alone or with just your favorite people, but also to learn how to be better beings. And that's really what we've been trying to do this whole time, right? Like exploring the whole victim perpetrator aspect by looking at war and control and all these things. We had to work through that, right? It's just like when you're a toddler and you have to learn how to handle yourself. You have a lot of temper tantrums along the way, and that's one way of seeing it. The aspects that we've discussed thus far have all pertained to the I am, but what about everyone else? We've talked about, throughout this series at least, what you can do. But I guess what I'm getting at is I think we should get other people into the fold too. We are all here for a reason. And the more that we embrace those reasons and each other, the easier it can make our own journey as well as everyone else's by helping one another. Humans are innately social creatures. So a big part of the issues I think that we are experiencing at this time is some separation, especially given all of the churchy stuff going on. It's so easy to feel lost and alone in these times, despite all the ways that we have to connect with each other that were not even possible until recently. And as much as we all want to connect with one another, and I believe that most of us do, none of us usually get out enough to accomplish that most of the time. Sure, birthdays and holidays, maybe. But for most of us, it's getting to that point where it isn't much more than that. For some, they don't even do that. At some level, we make a choice to isolate ourselves and others, oftentimes out of things like fear, inconvenience, physical discomfort. People are really heavy. As someone who runs a medical supply store, a lot of people over the age of 50 are having a really hard time getting around. And luckily, electric scooters are helping to bridge that gap a little bit. But while healthy living is on the horizons, a lot of our older generations haven't adapted yet. Imagine how many of those people could really use some company. Then we have irreconcilable differences. We just can't seem to agree on stuff, and we can't also just be at peace with what the other person believes. I think that as much as I want to roast some trolls online sometimes, I'm learning to not waste my time and even to say something loving or encouraging to them, because a lot of times hateful people or people that are ignorant are that way for a reason. All we can do is encourage the behaviors, the people, the things, and the places that matter most to us. And that's where we should be investing our time and energy. There are a lot of people who are just not fans of people, sadly. And I get that one a lot too. Okay, well, what about animals? What about the environment? Having grown up surrounded by family members pretty much daily, I can tell you that it feels strange to feel so distant from my family now, even after over a decade since my last grandmother passed away, taking with her the heart and soul of our families, from which they would never recover and rarely unite again after the memorial. Between this strange evolution where people no longer have to get together because grandma isn't making them, people get shitty towards each other. People use petty disagreements as a reason for, or excuse, to put distance between each other. Why? Why can't we all just get along despite our differences, or forgive and forget and move on? Much less the desire, combined with the church fading away slowly too, a population that once relied on the church for gatherings outside of family ones has become lost without that social network. Now that religion is going away, people look to find spirituality and answers elsewhere. Or sometimes they don't. Either way, there has been this other strange thing happening. There's never really been another source for communal connections outside of church and family. Certainly not a more effective one. I'll give that credit to church, because they really know how to get people to gather from the people within. Their congregation, if you will. Is it not the case that we all just want to be accepted and loved for who we are, and to have people to gather with, to talk to feel loved, to help and get help from? I say all of that because in that regard, not only are we at a pivotal point in our evolution, but so too are we finding ourselves living in a time where the decisions that we make going forward may have a huge impact on future generations in terms of how we handle this, which I feel like timed perfectly with COVID, in my opinion. While that whole mess did set communal gatherings back a bit and resulted in more people than ever working from home, at least in the United States, and further increasing the number of people living in near or complete isolation, it also helped us in reaching a breaking point between our standards and expectations in work and life balance. More people than ever before decided to go into business for themselves, many of whom are now working as delivery drivers, artists, writers, performers, and entrepreneurs, among countless other things. People are really doing what they love, what they want to be doing. You're reaching for the stars and grabbing them with both hands, and they're rocking at it, and I love it. I guess sometimes it just takes a million people dying to put things into perspective. On the bright side, people's schedules have certainly freed up a bit, or at least become a bit more flexible. Even just with the case of the employers hanging on to the people they have. Employers are a lot more flexible than they used to be. I remember going through that as a manager, and we really tried hard to please our current and future employees because we needed them. Right now, back then and still to this day, the job market is an employee's market. It's not like back in the day where the employers were the one, because they employees were a dime a dozen. Now jobs are a dime a dozen. We have more jobs right now in the United States than we have people. Isn't that amazing? Now that's abundance. Now, considering how much more information has become available about spirituality than when I first started down my path, it seems to me that a lot more people are seeking to fill a void that I believe getting away from religion has left for many. So I guess what I'm saying is that examining all of these things really can help us see who we want to be and what we came here to do. Again, using myself as an example, because that's all I have. I'm here to show you the way. Not by specifically advising you, but to share my journey with you. I have learned that not everyone wants my advice, but in offering up who I am and the truth about my journey, I'm hoping that there's a few golden nuggets you pick up along the way that are helpful, or that me just pointing the way might be. I'm here to empower you. And what better way can I do that in than helping you figure out what questions to ask? Not all of them I have posed today will apply to you, but you know which ones do, and still have them to refer to later, at which time you'll remember. Now, I know I excel at communication. I'm humbled and have experienced great pain and great loss. But I do not have to be defined by my pain and my past experiences or loss. I do not have to be defined by my disabilities, but will not be able to get away from them. I believe in unconditional love. And actually, I've surprised people in my capacity to love and accept others. And that's before I got to this point. Because I was always a loving person. It's why I can open up and trust people. I'm here to lead by example, at my best or at my worst. And on many occasions, I tend to be the picture child of what not to do by demonstrating why. It happens to all of us. I just happen to excel at it. I could go on and on about my takeaways after exploring these questions, but you get the idea. All of these things painted this crazy accurate picture of who I was, who I am, and who I want to be, which combined with those patterns really show us how our soul's purpose looks like and how we should proceed. My challenge for you today is to examine those questions for yourself and see what pops up into your mind. What questions or roadblocks come up in the process of doing so? And what are some patterns that you see throughout your life? Have you always been a talkative, quiet, reserved, or perhaps standoffish kind of person? Are there any lessons that you have seen present themselves to you time and time again? Is there something that you need to do, to finish, to heal, or to experience that you've been putting off? And what would it take for you to be able to do or resolve those things? Can you find space for other people in your daily life? If you aren't sure where to look, maybe that might be a good opportunity to try out volunteer work. It's highly rewarding. I've done a lot of different kinds of volunteer work with animals, with people, with picking up crap on the side of the road, cleaning out rivers. If you go through, a volunteer service, chances are good that you will find other people like you when you're both serving people, pets, or places that could really use some extra love in your community. How can you give and share love? I think that's another big part of the meaning of life. Love. Why else would we be such social creatures innately? Something to think about. As always, thank you again for joining me. Much love to you all. Until next time, namaste.